Welcome back everyone, and thank you for joining me once again in Manny School of Art. Today's episode will be the second episode in our watercolor series. Last week we talked about the materials and the supplies that we're going to need. Today we are going to focus on how to make a color wheel using watercolors, and we're also going to be looking at some basic watercolor techniques. If you want to follow along with this template is available for you on my website. I'll put a link on the bottom. Download it. Print it out, but if you print it out, make sure that you put it on either white cardstock or mixed media paper. You don't want to try to paint on copier paper. Okay. On the bottom of this, I put a cheat sheet for you guys so that you can actually see how all these colors are being made, because it is a little bit different making a color wheel with watercolors than it is like say acrylics or oils. Okay. So with that, let's go ahead and get started, and catch you here in a minute. Here are the things that you're going to need to create this color wheel. Download this color wheel right here, this template. We're going to be creating these hues on the top right here, plus with some brown, and then I'm also going to show you some things that we can do with these basic colors. Now, the basic colors that you're going to need, you only need 6. And I got these set up in a very specific way. So we have cadmium yellow, we had cadmium red. Now I put the phthalo blue on this side because that's a way to remember that you need the phthalo blue and the yellow to make your greens. Okay. The yellow and the cadmium red will give you your oranges, and the cadmium red and the crimson will give you a true red, but then you need crimson and ultramarine blue to make your purples. Okay. The brown, the sienna, is over here all by itself, and we can use that to create gray, and we can use that to make gold. And then I'm also going to show you how to diffuse or dull some of these colors by using its complements. Okay. And then you'll need a little container of water. I also have my container here for cleaning my brushes so I don't contaminate my paints. I have paper towels, and the only thing that I'm using for this right here is the number 2 flat brush, and it's a bristle, it's a sable brush, but you can use any soft brush as long as it's flat and it's small enough where we can get into these things right here. Alright, so here we go. For your yellow, all you need is your cad yellow. That's it. Watercolors are supposed to be see-through. So one of the big mistakes that I see students make when they start working with watercolors, especially first-time students, is that they try to use it like regular paint, and they put it on thick, and then you lose the biggest property of watercolors, which is that they are see-through or transparent. So make sure that you have enough water to make the colors see-through, but not so much water that you're losing the colors. So let's go ahead and do the first one, and just get it in here. You can see how nice and bright this color is. You can clearly see the name underneath, so that means that this is a pretty good mixture here. Now when we get excuse me, we're going to do the warm colors first. We're going to go all the way around. When we do the yellow, the yellow orange, I'm going to clean my brush, and then I'm just going to pick up a little bit of the cad red, and I'm going to mix them together. Okay, it's roughly 2 parts yellow to 1 part red. Now that looks a little bit too orange, so rather than wasting that, I'm just going to take a little bit of that, put it over here. Rinse and dry my brush, grab a little bit more of the yellow, and add it to this mixture. And I'll just test it. Yep, that looks pretty good. Okay, so that's going to be the yellow orange. So you can see that it should look a little bit darker than this, and it still needs to be see-through, so you still need to be able to see the lettering underneath. And dry my brush again. Now for the orange. Cadmium red is actually a fairly orange looking color already. So what I like to do is I'll take a little bit of the cadmium red, and depending on what I'm doing, I may brighten it up just a little bit. So I'm going to add just a little bit of yellow, and then that gives me the orange that I'm looking for. This would be a true orange, a secondary orange. And that would go here. Now for a red orange, that's where it starts to get a little tricky. So what you want to do is you want to mix up your orange, but then you're actually going to add a little bit, just a little bit of the crimson. Okay, crimson is kind of a strong color, so I'm going to test it here. That looks a little too red, so I'm going to add a little bit more of the cad. So be careful when you add that crimson because it is pretty strong. Okay, that looks better. So again, cleaning and drying my brush. I always dry my brush when I'm doing this, otherwise you get too much water in the brush and it makes the paint, like right there, is actually diluted too much. So I'm going to mix up a new batch. Cad red. And a tiny bit of the crimson. Just a tiny bit of the yellow. Oops, too much. Okay. Now to make I guess you can call it like a fire engine red, what you want to do is you want to mix some cad red and some crimson in about equal proportions. So I'm going to put a little bit of water over here because I don't want to mix that because it's got yellow in it. I don't want the yellow. So I'm going to grab a little bit of the cad red, a little bit of the crimson, and mix them together. And what I should get is a true red. Yep, I'm okay with that. So in a perfect world, red and yellow are always going to make orange. But when you're working with paint, when you're working with chemicals, you have to get the right kind of red and the right kind of yellows. Same thing when you work with the greens, same thing when you work with the purples. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to the red violet. So I'm going to clean up this area right here. And to make a red violet, the color in the front tells you which color is dominant. So red, so I'm going to use 2 parts of red and 1 part of the blue. And it's important that I use the right blue. So here I'm going to grab the red, the crimson. Make sure it's the crimson and not the cad red. And then get the ultramarine, about half as much as that. mix it up really good. It should look to the red side. I'm going to add just a little bit more crimson to that, just a little bit. There we go. So this is a red violet. So I'm going to reach in here and get my red violet in there. Then to make a true violet, I have red violet, so I'm just going to add just a little bit more of the ultramarine to it. Mix it up. Oops, a little too much blue. So you can see this does take a little getting used to. It's very easy. These colors are very strong. That's why I like to work with the concentrated colors. They are very strong, so they can get away from you in a heartbeat. But once you get used to it, it becomes pretty easy. Okay, so this looks like a better violet right here. So about equal amounts of the crimson and equal amounts of the ultramarine. And even though it's a dark color, you still want to make sure that it looks see-through. So it's a little bit harder to see, but you can still see the lettering underneath. If you're globbing it on and you can't see the letters underneath it anymore, then you need to add a little bit more water to it. Blue violet. So I have violet here. All I got to do is add a little bit more of the ultramarine. And I always like put the colors like next to it and then work them in. There we go. So there's the blue violet right there. Right. Now to get a true blue is similar to how we did the red. So let me clean up this area here real quick. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach in here and I'm going to get some of the ultramarine blue. Clean my brush. Grab some of the phthalo blue. They kind of, the whole point of this is to kind of get them to neutralize each other. So mix them together. Make sure you mix them all the way through. And that, yeah, that's a good blue there. Now, when I go to the green family, I have to use the phthalo blue and the yellow. So, for blue-green, that's approximately 2 parts of the phthalo blue. And 1 part of the cad yellow. Mix them together. Looks like it needs just a little bit more of the phthalo blue there. So I'm going to add a little bit more to it. There we go. Yep, there we go. So, again, test your colors. In fact, at school, well, you know, we make mistakes. Students make mistakes. I make mistakes. But we don't throw away the paper. All right, we use them for scraps. that way we can kind of test things out and experiment. So that's a blue-green. Now the one that's next to it, the first one that I made that was a little bit too green, that's still fine. So I can use this for regular green. Making sure that that's dry before I put my hand on it. And then for yellow green, there's 2 parts yellow to 1 part of the phthalo blue. So I'm just going to grab a little bit more of this yellow. I'm going to add it to this mixture that I have already. A little bit more water. Yep, that looks about right. Alright, so those are all the outside ones. Now, for the center one, for the brown, I actually use burnt sienna. In a perfect world, if you took a color and used as complement, in theory, it should turn brown. But with watercolors, more often than not, when you use a complement, it'll turn more to the gray side. So, that's the reason why I actually purchase the brown rather than mix it. And I used the warm brown, which is the burnt sienna, but you can also get burnt umber if you need like a darkish or really dark brown. So that's the upper part right here. These are the hues right here, and then the brown is a neutral. Now to make a gray, I like to actually make my own gray, but some people like to buy Payne's gray, which is a really nice gray. But I like to control the direction that I want my gray to go, so I like to mix my own. So for the gray, all you got to do is take the ultramarine blue and mix it with the sienna. And the neat thing about making your own gray is that you can basically take it in the direction that you want. So if you want it towards the brown side, take it to the brown side. If you want it towards the blue side, take it towards the blue side. You can even add a little bit of color to it. Right, so you can gray down a color. So for example, I can mix up a gray like this and then add purple to it, or add orange to it, or add whatever color I want it to it. But this is your basic gray. It's just the sienna plus the ultramarine blue. Make sure you use the ultramarine blue. Let's see what happens if you use the other blue. Right, so here's some burnt sienna. But this time, instead of the ultramarine blue, let's try the phthalo blue. So you can see, because the phthalo blue is a warm blue, you get a very different looking grayish color. So let's see what happens if I add a little more sienna to it. Very different. So, doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that it's not your traditional gray. However, if you need this color, by all means go for it. Right? Because rarely when we're painting do we use true colors. It's usually colors that we're using and we're mixing, and we're getting variations of those colors. So this one is burnt sienna in ultramarine, and this is burnt sienna in the phthalo. And then in the middle ones, if you want to play with it, you can mix up some gray and then add different colors to it. So for here, I'm just going to add a little bit. We'll go with this one. I'll add a little bit of the crimson, just so you can see. Here's the crimson, it's nice and bright, but look what happens when we mix it with that gray, how it dulls it down. Right? That's one way of dulling a color. So let's throw that in there and see. So you can see this crimson versus this one or this one, very different. Let's try burnt sienna, ultramarine to make a gray. And then let's add a little yellow to it. No, let's add a little bit of the cad red, so you can see how all of these colors that I'm putting here have been grayed down, basically. They have been muted. And let's try one with purple. So let's mix up a little purple. So that's a little bit of ultramarine, a little bit of the crimson, and then let's mix up some gray. And just bring some of this over here. Oops, looks like I should have mixed some more. Okay. So, and it goes on and on. You could do that with all of your colors. So, but the ideal gray, in my opinion, is your sienna and your ultramarine blue. And then to make a gold, all you got to do, oops, let me clean this up again, which is one of the reasons why I like to use the bigger palette. Notice that I don't never mix over here. Those I need to keep those colors nice and clean. So to make a gold, all you got to do is grab yourself a little bit of the sienna and then just add some yellow to it. And you get, basically you're warming that sienna up quite a bit, kind of like a golden color. And just like before, you can play with it. You can add more yellow to it, you can add more sienna to it, you can try adding a little orange with it, but keep them warm. Don't add like any blues or purples to it when you're doing this, otherwise you're going to lose the brightness. So let's try doing that with a little bit more water, just to brighten it up a little bit more. And let's try that with a little bit more yellow. So just play with it, right? Because there's lots of variations of colors. So this has a little bit more yellow in it. Let's try one with a tiny bit of orange. I'm going to keep that. Touch the red, the cad red. Keeping them nice and warm. So don't add any of the blues or purples or anything like that. See what happens if we take the sienna with the cad orange all by itself. Well, to me it's not bright enough. Nope. So we're going to stop there with the gold. And if you want it brighter or lighter, just add a little bit more water. And then the last one on here is how do we dull a color? Well, you can dull a color by using its complement, right? So for example, the opposite of yellow is violet. The opposite of red is green. The opposite of orange is blue. So an easy way to remember that is it takes two colors to make secondary and tertiary colors. For example, I have red and blue make up violet. So yellow is the other primary that's left out. That is its complement, right? So if I'm making a green, I need yellow and blue, so the complement or the color that's left out is the red. So that's the complement of green. So whichever color is left out of your mixture, that's the complement. So let's see how that works. Okay, so let's start off with something simple. Now, I'm going to start off with pure yellow over here. And then we said that the opposite of yellow is purple or violet. So I'm going to mix up a little bit of violet over here. Now you have to be super careful with this because violet is a much stronger color than the yellow. So you need very, very little of this to dull this color down. So if I take a little bit of that and mix it together, now you can see, I'll put it next to this one. Okay, it's a little duller. I can add just a little bit more to it. So again, these things you have to kind of experiment with. So, and the more of the purple that I add, the duller the color will become. So you can see there that this, is yellow plus a touch of violet. I'm going to do it again, but with a little bit more paint. So I'm going to add just a little bit more yellow. So you can see it a little better. See how much duller that color looks compared to the yellow all by itself, which is nice and bright. You can do that with anything. So let's try green plus red. So let me get that out of there. So first I'll mix up a little bit of green. There's a nice green. And then try the red. Now you could try the cad red or you can try the crimson. Try both and see what happens. So the first one I'm going to do it with the cad. Just put a little bit here. Grab a little bit of the green. And let's see what happens. So this is green plus the cadmium red. So you can see how much duller, how much duller this is than that. And if I want to dull it even more, I would just add more of the red, right? So even though we're only working with 6 colors, you can make a whole variety of colors here. Now let's try the same green. But this time I'm going to throw a little bit of crimson into it. Should get a totally different hue, or excuse me, not hue, but a totally different color. So there, actually, I use a little bit too much purple, but it's okay because that paper is still wet. So I'm just going to throw the blue, or excuse me, the green right on top of it, and then just mix them on the paper. So you can see the difference. This one was with the cad red, and this is with the crimson red. So big difference. And you can do that. You can just keep going on and on and on and take all of these colors and dull them to create even more colors. Okay. As far as white, we don't use white, or I shouldn't say we. I don't use white with my watercolors. I'll use Frisket to protect the area because white is a pastel color and it tends to, in my opinion, mess up the effect sometimes. So I prefer to use the white paper anytime that I need white. And I rarely use black. I prefer to darken up the colors by using their complements or by using a little bit of purple with them. If I do need pure black, I tend to use ink because once the ink dries, it doesn't smear and doesn't smudge the other colors. But again, you can try black watercolors and see if you like mixing them with the other colors. To me, it just, I don't know, they lose their vibrancy when you use black instead of its complement. Okay. All right, so that's how the color wheel was done. And then let me switch to a different paper and we'll get right into the swatches. Alright, now that we're done with the color wheel, we can move on to the swatches. I'm going to show you 6 different things that we can do with watercolors. There's more, but these are 6 that are very common. This format that I showed you is what I typically use with my students at school, but when I paint on my personal studio, I like to use a full palette. And the reason for that is because if I want to pre-mix my colors, I have all these extra slots right here. Plus, I can do my mixing here or here. And if I do it here, I can just take this off and clean it when I'm done. Plus it folds, so it fits in my tackle box really nice. I don't have to worry about stuff, debris getting on there. Okay? Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. The first one I'm going to show you is masking. I mentioned when we were doing the color wheel that we don't actually use white in watercolors. Okay, so how do we protect the paper? There's several ways of doing it. I'm going to show you a couple that are super easy. For the first one, you can just use regular old masking tape, but you don't want the tape to be too strong, right? So if you're using masking tape, I'm going to show you on my arm. What I typically do is make sure I kill the tape, right? I'm going to put it here first like so, and then take it off. And what that does, it takes some of the glue off, okay? Because you don't want to accidentally rip your paper when you take the masking tape off. I believe that they sell watercolor tape, but I'm not 100% sure. I've always done this technique, and as long as I remember to take some of the glue off, it works just fine. Okay, these can be cut into different shapes, so it doesn't always have to be straight lines. You can actually put them on a cutting board and cut out specific designs. So it's just a way of masking or protecting the white area. The second way is liquid Frisket. I use this a lot, right? Especially when I'm getting into really small areas. Now, the key to liquid Frisket is this. Never use good quality brushes because it will ruin your brushes. And what I like to do, I like to take a synthetic brush like this, and before I actually use the Frisket, I'm going to take some dishwashing liquid, just plain old dishwashing liquid, and I'm going to work the bristles. I'm going to work the dishwashing liquid into the bristles. And that helps me when it's time to clean this brush. It helps to get the Frisket off, right? Shake the Frisket up really good. Remember that this is just basically like a liquid latex, so if it sits around for a long time, all of that stuff will go to the bottom. And then you just paint it on however you want. So if you have like a specific drawing and there's areas that you need to keep nice and bright, you just put it on. The thickness, you want to keep it kind of a creamy consistency. You don't want to put it on too thin, but you don't want to glob it on either. So that's Frisket. Now before we can actually paint over it, we have to let it dry. So I'm going to let this dry for a little bit, and then we'll come back to it. Now before the Frisket has a chance to dry on this, you want to make sure, I'll put this here, that you clean it off really good. Remember that these have those little things on the bottom, so I'm rubbing the brush pretty well along there. You can see with that soap there ahead of time that it actually helped keep the Frisket from sticking inside of the bristles. Okay, and that'll work with any synthetic brush. Please do not use these on your good brushes because they will ruin them. Okay. Alright, so while that's drying, let's go on to the next one. The next one is a flat wash, and all that means is that when I paint this area, I want the entire area to be the same. I don't want any gradient, and I don't want any additional colors. And you can do this with whatever color you want. So, just like before, have my clean water, have a little area here for me to mix. And when you're practicing these, it doesn't really matter what color you choose. Just pre-mix it ahead of time and make sure that you have enough water in it. So like this one here is kind of sticky, so I'm going to use a little bit more water to make sure it's nice and soupy. Okay, by the way, I'm using 80-pound watercolor paper, and I got it all taped down just so that when it dries it'll flatten out. Now the key to a flat wash is that you got to keep the lower edge wet. If you do this and you let that bottom edge dry on you, you're never, it's harder to blend. Okay? So, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the entire wash to pretty much look the same. So there's no variance in it whatsoever. Now you see all those dark areas. All I'm going to do is clean my brush, dry the brush, and then I'm just going to use the brush kind of like a sponge, and then just boom, and then let the water take care of the rest. Like right there, I got a little bit, took a little bit too much off, so there we go. So that is a flat wash. The second one is a gradient wash. So as the name implies, it needs to get lighter as it goes down, or darker, depending on your preference. Personally, I like to go, when I'm doing a gradient, I like to start off with full color and let it get lighter. And the reason for that is because, personally, I'll do this by wetting the area first with clean water. And I'm not saturating the area, I'm just dampening it just a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and pick a new color. Just I'm going to keep my colors dark today just so that it's easier to see in the camera, but again, you can use whatever colors you want. So, how do I do a gradient? I'm going to start off with full strength in the area that I want to be darker. In this case, I'm going to do the top. And then as it comes down, I'm just going to let it pick up some of that water, so I dry my brush, and then I'm just going to keep moving it down. And I should also tilt my board. But, so as it comes down, it's picking up more and more of the water that is on the paper, and it gets lighter. Okay. So that's a gradient, and you can see a little bit of the texture of the paper showing. That's okay. That's pretty much all there is to a gradient. So it's going to go from pure color, and then it's going to get lighter. If you wanted to go the opposite direction, you would just do it upside down, but just going from light to dark or dark to light. Gradient. Okay. So that's almost there, not quite there yet. So let's go on to blending. And for today's demo, I'm just going to blend two colors, but you can do this with as many different colors as you want. as long as you work relatively fast. So since I have this blue right here, and I got lots of it, I'm going to put a little yellow here. And what I'm going to do, instead of pre-mixing these and making a green, I'm actually going to do it on here. I personally enjoy mixing colors on the paper instead of always pre-mixing them here. So similar to when I did the gradient, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to wet this area just a little bit, just to dampen it. And what that does, especially when you're mixing colors, it gives you a little extra time to blend your colors. Okay. So let's change it up. Let's go yellow on the top and blue on the bottom. And if I do it correctly, we'll get a really nice green in the middle. So I'm going to start with my yellow up here. Because the paper is wet, you don't have to rush as much. Clean my brush. Then I'm going to reach in here to the phthalo blue. I'm going to put it near the bottom. Again, you can see the paper is nice and wet. So this is not an issue at all. I don't have to rush. Now what I'm going to do before I meet the two together, clean my brush and dried it without adding any more color. I'm going to start to put these two together. And you can decide how much of each color you want. So like for example, if I want my green to be a little bit stronger, then I would bring the yellow more down, or I can add more yellow to it. But I want this to be subtle. Clean my brush, dry my brush, and then right here before that yellow and that yellow green dry, just going to gently hit it. Okay. So the idea is to get a nice transition between one color and the next. So that looks pretty good right there. So I like to do this technique quite a bit actually, because I'm one of those artists that prefers to blend on my canvas instead of always blending my colors out here. Okay, the next one is layering. And the key to layering is that you have to put one color down and then you have to dry it thoroughly before trying to put the new color on top. The other important thing is that dark color can always go over a light color, but a light color over a dark color is difficult. So if you are layering, make sure that you do your light colors first. And I'll show you over here, we'll talk about this a little bit. So let's say for example that I have something in the background that's like, I don't know, let's say like an orange color. And then there's going to be something dark in the foreground on top of it. This would work just fine. Right? So let's just go ahead and paint an orange color here. And this can be done over a flat wash or a gradient wash. It doesn't really matter. It's just make sure, make sure that this is dry before you try to layer. Because if you try to put a new layer on here right now, here I'll show you just a little bit. Let's say that I wanted to put something on here and I wanted some details, and I try to do that while the paper is still wet. Now we're going to get that detail. So you have to make sure that it's dry. So let's get rid of that real quick. Then we'll let that dry and then we'll come back to it. So while that's drying, while this one is drying, yeah, I think we can do the masking. So And this, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I just want to show you that you can paint right over this without any fear. So let's go with a nice rich color here. Let's do some purple. So this is nice and dry already. So you can see that you can paint right over it. And you can see how the color is kind of beading. That tells you where the mask is, where the frisket is. And let's do a little bit of red violet on the other side just for fun. Over here somewhere. Now the important part about masking, you never want to take the mask off while the paper is wet. It will rip your paper. So you have to allow that to dry thoroughly before you remove the mask. Okay. So while that's drying, we can do this one. So let me get the salt. Salt and watercolors have a very cool reaction that happens. And it's very useful, especially when you're trying to create like turf textures and you don't want to sit there with a tiny brush and make a whole bunch of little dots and whatnot. So you can use salt. Okay. The different types of salt will create different effects. The size of the grains will create different effects. So play around with some. I actually have like really big crunchy salt. I have really fine salt, and then I have this stuff which is kind of somewhere in between. And the key to this is you have to make sure that you do this while the paper is wet and saturated with color. But then you have to make sure that you give the salt time to do its job. If you take the salt off too early, it won't work. Right? It just won't work. So I'm going to paint this, and I'm going to make sure that I have plenty of color on here, but plenty of water also, right? I don't want this to be too dry. I don't want the paint to be dry. And then while that's wet, all I'm going to do is I'm going to sprinkle it with salt. And you decide how much you want. Alright, so I just take some salt and I sprinkle it. Now I need to allow that to dry naturally. If I force dry it with the hair dryer, I will actually cut the reaction time that it takes for the salt to do its job. So I will let that dry naturally, and it should only take about 10 minutes. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay, so I am going to dry this with the hair dryer, but not this one, just so that I can show you guys how to take the mask off. Alright, so I got this all nice dry. The salt is still doing its thing over here. So let's go ahead and do a little bit of layering. Now I mentioned a little while ago that you can always put a dark color on top of a light color. So now that this is completely dry, I can take and do whatever I want on top of it to a degree. I have to be careful that I don't like oversaturate the paper and reactivate the color underneath. So let's say, for example, that I was doing some sort of underwater scene and I needed to create some plants or some reefs or something like that. Because this layer is completely dry, it's okay for me to draw or paint right on top of it. And you could see that the details hold up really nice. So I'm using my number 2 here, and I've pretty much taken it to a nice chiseled point. And because the color underneath is nice and dry, these colors that I'm putting on right now will stay exactly where I want them to be. And you can do that with multiple colors. So like if I wanted to put a shadow here, I can do that. So I'm just going to add a little bit of a shadow here. So this layering technique is basically wet on dry. So the key there is to make sure that the layer underneath is completely dry. Okay. Now let's go ahead and take off these masks. Be careful, especially with the tape, right? Because you don't want to accidentally rip. So make sure, like I said before, that the paper is completely dry. And then if you took off enough of the glue before you put it on the paper, this should not be a problem whatsoever. But if you would have let the glue at full strength, then there's a very good chance that it would actually rip a little bit of the paper. And the other thing is, especially with the tape, you do not want to leave this on for any length of time. So the sooner that you can dry it and get it off, the better. The longer it stays on the paper, the more it tends to adhere, and then the bigger the risk of it ripping your paper when you take it off. Okay. For the liquid Frisket, you can use one of these. Usually when you buy a Frisket, the liquid Frisket, it comes with one of these. It's just a Frisket remover, and it just basically lifts. You can see it. It lifts the Frisket right off. Right? You can see that's just latex. That's all it is. If you don't have one of these, you can just rub it off with your finger. Just like that. And now you can go in there and paint. Okay. And that brings me back to this. Let's say that you do need a dark background, but you need some bright stuff in the middle. You have to mask it, right? Because if I try to go with a light color on top of a dark color, it doesn't work. So if I mask off the area first and then put in my dark colors, dry it, remove the masking, whatever it is, whether it's Frisket or tape, then that preserves the white area so that I can turn around and put the light colors over the dark background. Okay, so we'll let that sit just a little bit longer, and then we'll go ahead and take it off. Alright, so all this stuff has had time to dry. Now, to take the extra salt off, you can take something plastic. So you can use something like a plastic palette knife or like an old card like this, and then just scrape off all of the extra stuff. And all of the patterns that are created by the salt will actually be there underneath the colors. You can get some really cool effects. And now that this is dry, just like here, I can actually add colors on top of it, layers on top of it. So these are some of the basic techniques that we're going to be using throughout the series. I'm also going to be introducing some that are probably not as familiar, but these are the more common ones, and you'll see me use these over and over again in my paintings. In our next episode, we're going to be creating a very simple painting just to kind of get used to working with mixing colors and also just some of the very basic techniques, and we'll keep it nice and simple just to get familiar and to kind of walk through the steps as to how we go from a drawing to a watercolor painting. So hopefully you'll tune in for that. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if this video was helpful to you, make sure that you like, share, and don't forget to subscribe. Alright, we'll see you next time.